Hi, good morning, and thank you for being here. My name is Itziar, and I am a PhD student at the University of the Basque Country. Today, I'm going to talk about my research on localization of video games, from the localization process to the end user. The research is divided in 4 different stages that depend on one another. The objective of the first one is to create a video game catalog. In the second one, a survey is distributed among the developers of the games of the catalog. Then, some of the games are selected for a product analysis, and finally, in the fourth stage, a reception survey is distributed among gamers. The process has been long and started back in 2017, so it only includes games published until 2016. For the research we were going to do, games had to be available in Spanish, either originally published in Spanish or translated. Because there are many video game platforms, we limited the catalog to computer games published on Steam, which back in 2017 was the most popular video game website according to the daily visitors. I manually copied the title, publication date, and other relevant information from the website. Thanks to Steam Spy, a website with information about Steam, we also had an idea of the number of players for each game. The result was a very big Excel file with all the information, with a total of 3,143 games. Some of the relevant information that we verified is that some developers and editors can present themselves with different names. This means that it is difficult to achieve a realistic idea of how many different developers there are, because you don't always recognize them. There are also companies that close a couple of years after releasing their game, which shows that publishing a game doesn't have any guarantees of continuity. Some companies are made up of international teams, and they don't have any physical headquarters because all the developers work from home in their own countries. Companies from different countries, such as Sweden or Greece, may decide to publish their games only in English and not in their native languages. After finishing the catalog, we prepared a survey to be distributed among the developers of the games included in the catalog, with some limitations. We decided to limit the population of the survey to a decade, partly because we wanted to work with relatively recent games, and partly because for the first years, Steam didn't publish many games. By eliminating the games published between 1995 and 2005, we only eliminated 140 games, which left us with 3,003 games for the population of our survey. We wanted to do a probability sample of the population. To achieve this, the games had to be randomly chosen. We extracted a random selection of games and contacted their developers several times. Working with a probability sample means that the results can be generalized to the whole population. To achieve the usually accepted level of precision for our population size, we needed a sample of 341 answers. Unfortunately, we only got 167 answers, which means that our margin of error is around 7% instead of the usually accepted 5%. The results I am going to show you could differ from the reality in about 7%. One of the main points of interest of the questionnaire was to confirm the original language of video games. In our sample, almost 83% of the developers say that they develop their games in English. As to why, almost half of the developers say that they write their games in English because more games are sold in this language. In another question that is not shown here, we confirmed that half of the games in the market have not been written by native speakers. This information, together with the fact that some websites are only published in English, as we have seen in the catalog conclusions, show that many developers don't think it is necessary to have a native speaker to write a game. This could mean that they won't necessarily look for a native translator either. The most popular Spanish dialect is still Spanish from Spain, which accounts for more than half the cases. Neutral Spanish is used in about 27% of the cases, and Latin American Spanish is only used in about 10% of the games. In the 4 states, we will see if Spanish speakers gladly accept games translated into a different dialect. The profile of the translator can change a lot. In 35% of the cases, the translation is done by a company, but there are also freelance translators in 17% of the cases, colleagues whose native language is the target language, 12%, and volunteers, also with a 12%. The type of translator largely depends on the size of the company. While big companies rely almost entirely on translation companies, small companies with less than 5 employees work mainly with volunteers, colleagues, and also translation companies. It seems that companies with more resources prefer to trust solid companies for the translation, but small companies don't have the resources for it. However, when asked for the reason to choose that particular translator profile, 62% of the developers say that they value the confidence in the translator's work above the price or the deadline. It seems that companies need to feel they can trust their translator, be it a professional translator or a volunteer. One of the main complaints of video game translators is that they can't play nor see the game before translating it. According to our developers, more than half of the translators can play the game before translating it. One may think that small companies would be more open with their games than big companies, but in our sample, the differences are not statistically significant between big and small companies. The other big complaint I have heard from video game translators is that they must work in an Excel file, which was intended for mathematics rather than translations. Our developers confirm what translators say. About 45% of the games were translated using an Excel file. The next most popular file format they use is Google Docs, which was not intended for translations either. XML and Notepad are popular formats too. One of the participants in the survey thought that PO-get-text was a normal industry standard, but it seems that only 2.4% of the sample uses this format. This graphic shows that there is still a lot of work to do before we achieve an industry standard adequate for translations. In the third stage of the PhD, we built a corpus from the catalog to analyze the final product. The games for the analysis needed to be part of the 167 games whose developers had participated in the process survey. To make sure that we were working with quite spread games, we eliminated the games that had less than 3,000 players, according to Steam Spy. We wanted to analyze the following 5 categories. An exhaustive localization process, understood as a game which had undergone strong internationalization, localization, revision, and quality testing steps. A less exhaustive localization, a translation done by volunteers, a translation done with a machine translation software, and a translation where the translator had great liberty to separate from the original. There were 20 games in our catalog that met these conditions, but as we didn't have time to analyze them all, we decided to divide the corpus in half. We chose the games that were more linguistically interesting, that is, the games which had more text, and we ended up with 10 games, 2 for each category. Here is a summary of some of the general conclusions we extracted from the analysis. As you can see, we analyzed about 2,000 words in most of the games. That is the limit we have established for time reasons. And however, the 2 of the games that were machine translated barely had any text at all. So the first conclusion that may be extracted from the analysis is that machine translation is used for games with little text. The title of the game was not translated for any of the 10 games. Regardless of the original source language, which was German in 2 of the games, the title was always used in English. The graphical text was also in English in all cases but one, where it had been translated into Spanish. Following previous works from Santoyo, Pajares, and Merino, we divided the phenomena we found in 4 different categories: addition, inequivalence, modification, and elimination, each with their own subcategories. For the purpose of the fourth states, it was important to distinguish between the phenomena that Spanish players could see while playing and the phenomena that you can only see if you compare the source text and the target text. We noticed that the vast majority of inequivalences can be seen by the player, but additions, modifications, and eliminations are invisible if you only play in Spanish. Some of the subcategories we have for inequivalences were typos, as shown in the first example, incorrect calques in the use of gerunds, as shown below in the second example, and there were also contradictions between the image and the dialogue. For example, when the word you is translated as a plural pronoun, but there is only one character on screen. When translating from English into Spanish, the translation usually takes about 30% more space than the original. In one game, the font was reduced so much to fit in the same space that the text was illegible. The phenomena that can be seen by the player are more important than those disguised in the translation, especially if they are inequivalences, as most of them are. It is interesting to see that games that have been translated by volunteers have more inequivalences than games that have been translated by professional companies or freelancers. Doing a more or less exhaustive localization process, on the contrary, does not seem to affect the number of inequivalences found, at least in our corpus. The last stage of the PhD is a reception survey to check how gamers value localization. In the second stage, we did a probability survey by randomly selecting a sample from the total population. In this case, there is an estimated amount of 17 million Spanish gamers, and we didn't have the tools to select a random sample. Instead, we simply distributed the survey among our contacts and hoped for the best. We got 569 valid answers, but the sample is not representative of the population because too many of the participants have university-level studies and too many of them have studied a degree related to languages like translation and interpretation. This means that conclusions cannot be generalized, but they give us some clue for future and more exhaustive studies. In the survey, we asked participants to confirm if they cared when a game was not localized. When the game is not localized at all, opinions are divided. 15% get angry about it, 28% are okay with it, and 35% of the people say it depends on the available languages. When the game is partially localized, that is when the subtitles are translated but the audio is not dubbed, 60% of the participants don't care at all. Only about 5 or 6% of the participants would renounce to buy a game if it is not localized into Spanish. If the game is not localized at all, almost half of the participants would buy the game anyway, and almost another half say it depends on the language and the type of game. If the subtitles are available in Spanish, 2/3 of the sample would definitely buy it, and 20% would look at the available languages first. Interestingly, people are less eager to buy games in a different Spanish dialect. While only about 5% would not buy a game that is only available in English, 22% of the players would not buy a game in a different Spanish dialect. If the game has a lot of text in it, most gamers prefer to have everything translated. If there isn't a lot of text, though, the opinions are quite leveled and 25% of the people don't really care about the language. The participants were asked to watch 2 videos from 2 different games from our previous analysis. The first game had been translated by volunteers, and it was the game with the most inequivalencies. The second video was an example of a very well done localization. 40% of the players said they had seen mistakes in the first video, and 11% saw mistakes in the second video. The difference is statistically significant and shows that mistakes don't go unnoticed. Participants were then asked to value the quality of the translation of the 2 videos in a scale from 1 to 6. The evaluation of the game that had more inequivalences peaks in the negative half of the scale. The game translated by professionals, on the contrary, was mostly described as a very well translated game. Finally, players were asked to identify the most popular types of mistakes they find in the games they usually play. According to our sample, the most worrying characteristic of localized games is the dialogue not being natural. About 17% of the participants think the subtitles are sometimes too small and sometimes too quick. Grammar or punctuation mistakes and bad quality dubbing are considered a problem by 15% of the players. Although the PhD is still not finished, we can already draw some conclusions from the research. First, English is the most important language for developers. Titles, images, and the website will remain only in English if only one language can be chosen, even if it is not the native language of the developers. Spanish from Spain is still the most popular dialect, although there are by far more speakers in Latin American Spanish. Excel is indeed the most popular file format, but it was not created with translations in mind, and there are better options available. Big companies rely mainly on professionals and small companies on volunteers. Video games translated by volunteers, though, have more inequivalencies than games translated by professionals. The profile of the translator is more important for the final result than doing an exhaustive localization process. Gamers prefer localized games, but they are ready to buy not localized or partially localized games. Spanish-speaking gamers don't like games in other dialects. They prefer to play in a foreign language rather than play in a different dialect. Finally, gamers detect mistakes and value translations without mistakes. The general conclusion of the PhD is that the localization process, the selection of the translator, and the level of localization affect the final product and the opinion of the end users. In general, gamers will buy not localized games and games translated by volunteers, but they appreciate the difference a good localized game translated by professionals makes. This is all for now. Thank you very much for listening. I know this was brief and maybe too summarized, but I wanted to let you have a look at all the stages of the process. We could go much deeper in methodology, bibliography, and results. I have only shown you the main points, but if you want to learn more or have any questions or suggestions, do please write to the email address you can see on screen, and I will gladly discuss anything with you. Thank you.